Hey everybody, it's Josh here again. In today's video, we're going to talk about steps you can take to get really good at interviewing for cybersecurity positions. This video is going to be broken down into four main sections. The first section being industry exposure, the second section being mindset, the third being general communication during your interview and practice questions, and then the fourth section is being all the easy stuff that's left over. I'm also going to include a pretty decent list of practice cybersecurity interview questions in the video description, and I'm going to talk about many of the interview questions that I've received in a lot of my jobs. And you should definitely know these questions. They're kind of used to gauge your fundamental understanding of cybersecurity in general, so definitely stick around for that. And lastly, if this is your first time seeing me and you have no idea who I am, my name is Josh and I'm a master job hopper. I've had a whole bunch of jobs in my career, a whole bunch of IT jobs, whole bunch of security jobs. I actually made this video here outlining my career, like each job I had, what I did at each job, and my salary for each job. So if you care about that kind of thing, go ahead and check that out. But otherwise, go ahead and smash the like button for the algorithm and let's get started. So the very first thing that you should do to get better interviewing for cybersecurity jobs is get some industry exposure. And in my opinion, the best way to do this is through podcasts. If you're new and you want to get into information security, you should definitely start listening to podcasts like right now, like today, for at least an hour a day, at least 5 days a week. And there's many reasons for this, like many ways that they're beneficial. I'll get into all the reasons why I think they're beneficial in just a second, but there's two main podcasts that I would recommend. And by the way, I'm not sponsored by either one of these. I just like them a lot, and I used these when I was trying to get into security myself. The first podcast I would recommend is called Darknet Diaries by Jack Rhysider. This podcast is super entertaining with like super high production quality, and he talks about all kinds of really cool stuff like nation state operations, like really famous hacks, really famous exploits and whatnot. And he also interviews a lot of famous hackers like Doggy G and Sammy, like the MySpace worm guy, and a whole bunch of other cool guys. Like, highly recommend this podcast. Not only is it like really interesting, it's really kind of inspiring too, because he covers a lot of different aspects of information security, and it kind of gives you ideas of like where you might want to work in the future. So this is the first one I'd recommend. I'd start watching this one from episode 1 and just watch it all the way through. And the second podcast I would recommend is called The Cyberwire. This one's kind of a news-centric podcast, and it covers all of like kind of latest security events, like what's going on around the world and whatnot. Again, this one's super high production quality. There's like a whole crew that puts together this podcast and puts it out every day. I think they even do it on the weekends now, like Saturday at least. It's pretty good. It has commercials. The free version has commercials, but even the commercials are useful because you can kind of hear about vendors and like what they do and the different stuff that's offered in the security world. It's a pretty good podcast. I would recommend listening to this one too. There's so many episodes. I think there's like over 1,000 now, so I wouldn't start from the beginning because it's just kind of news. So maybe just subscribe to it and then just watch it from today's version, like going forward, and just kind of keep caught up with it. Darknet Diaries I'd watch from the very beginning, but The Cyberwire I just pick up from today's date going forward. There's probably a bunch of other podcasts out there too, but these are two of my absolute favorites, and they'll definitely help you. Now, getting on to why I think you should listen to podcasts. First of all, you can get a kind of general sense for what's going on in the world right now and a lot of the famous events that have happened in the past that we can use today to protect ourselves in the future. That's kind of the first thing. The second thing is just listening to the podcast passively will increase your security vernacular by like a lot within at least like the first month or something. There's a lot of jargon in our industry, and it will be hard to kind of articulate your thoughts and sound like you're any kind of professional without kind of being exposed to it all the time. So if you don't already work in security and you're not already surrounded by CISOs and like, security analysts and security engineers, the next best thing you can do is listen to podcasts, and you'll kind of passively absorb all of that jargon, like APTs, IOCs, TTPs. This is incredibly important for the interview process because when you're talking about security stuff and you already have your brain like preloaded with all of this jargon that you've heard from all these security engineers and analysts and like really, smart people in the industry, it becomes much easier to articulate yourself when you're actually interviewing. So highly recommend listening to podcasts. Also, while listening to podcasts, you'll kind of develop a general knowledge for the different hacker groups around the world, and kind of knowing about this stuff and having it come out in conversation kind of shows that you have at least some sense of passion for the field, and it will be really impressive to your interviewers or anyone else who might care that you have knowledge of these things. So yeah, listen to podcasts like from today from today on. So the second thing that you can do is be cognizant and kind of work on your mindset in general going into the interview. Like cybersecurity can be really difficult to work in because you have to kind of strike this balance between securing the business, not pissing off operations too much, and kind of even forming relationships with them, like positive relationships, as well as not crippling the business with too many security controls too fast. You kind of have to juggle and like kind of balance all three of these things really effectively to be a good security employee, I guess. You just have to be really flexible and not lean too much in one way or the other. For example, you might get this interview question. There's a production app heavily used by the core business in the network running an out-of-date version of Java with a known remote code execution vulnerability. You're brought onto the company to remediate the company's most critical vulnerabilities, this being one of them. The operations team tells you the vulnerability cannot be patched because the app running on that server relies on an old version of Java to function. What do you do? This is a good example question because you're brought on essentially to fix the company's most critical vulnerabilities, and you're presented with a critical vulnerability, so what do you do? While you're brought on to mitigate vulnerabilities, you're basically, the reason you're brought on is to mitigate company risk to an acceptable level. And if you, for example, if you were to patch this vulnerability right away, it said that it was used by a core business function that requires an older version of Java. So if you patch this right away, that core business function will no longer work, right? So you're essentially, by patching it, you're like, I'm secure now, but you've essentially denial of service the business, and you can't have that because, you know, you're the security engineer. So you kind of have to strike a balance between, you know, fixing the vulnerability and allowing the company to keep functioning. You have to have that kind of mindset with the business. You have to keep the business in mind. For in this case, in my opinion, the correct answer would be something like, yeah, you can ask the interviewer other questions like, are there other compensating controls around this app? Like, are there other stuff that would prevent someone from exploiting it? Like maybe we can push off the remediation for now if there's compensating controls, and then we can kind of explore plan of action and milestones to maybe fix the app down the road, like 6 months or a year down the road or something like that. It just depends. So when you're in your interview, don't lean like too far, like one way or the other. Like don't say like, oh, I'll just fix it right away because it's vulnerable, because then you DDoS or you DOS the business, right? You can't do that. And you can't just leave it, right? You can't just be like, oh, I'll just leave it because the business relies on it. You have to strike some kind of balance. You have to have that mindset where you're kind of flexible, like you're security oriented, like in your brain, but you're also aware of the business needs, and you don't want to make the business suffer or disturb operations too much, right? Otherwise, you're not any better than like a hacker, right? Ruining the business and disrupting availability. So yeah, mindset, that's number 2. The third step would be communication and practice questions. For this step, you should get a whole bunch of cybersecurity practice interview questions, read each question carefully, think about how you would answer it, and practice saying it out loud. Like practice articulating your answer out loud to yourself. You don't need to get another person to like ask you the questions and then you answer back. Just get your phone with a bunch of questions on it, like go on a walk and practice answering the questions out loud to yourself. Doing this will help you with a couple of things. Obviously, it will increase your knowledge about security because, you know, you're learning like questions and answers to things, but that's not really the main point. The main point to this is to be able to articulate your thoughts really well in a nice, succinct manner. That is, a nice, concise manner without a bunch of filler in there like, like this kind of thing. Because if you practice articulating your responses to these questions, you'll be able to do it really well in their interview without thinking. Like you can tell when some people are talking, like if you ask them a question in an interview and they do like a lot of pauses and they say like a lot of like it kind of comes across as maybe not necessarily they don't know what they're talking about, but they're having problems like articulating their thoughts and like drawing on the knowledge, opposed to somebody where they may answer like really quickly because the answer is second nature to them. So going over like hundreds of questions, or at least 100, and getting good at articulating the answer to them, that will help you a lot immensely in their interview, because when somebody asks you a question, you'll be able to answer it really quickly without thinking very much. And when you don't have to think very much about answering the question, it kind of frees up the space in your brain to think about other things, like, you know, showing your personality more, or relating to the interviewer more, or coming up with your own questions or something like this. This is an incredibly important point, so I have to say it again. So the more you practice interview questions before your interview, the more brain power you're going to have left over during your interview, and the more brain power you have left over during your interview, you can focus on other aspects of the interview, which is really, really important. It's really important because you can come across more as a human being if you have more of your brain power free. And a lot of the points of interviews is they just want to get to know you as a person. Obviously, they want to make sure you're technically sound. So they'll have a portion of the interview for like technical soundness, and then another portion to kind of gauge you as a person. And if a lot of your brain power is freed up, a lot of it will be left over to kind of relax, and then you can kind of show them who you are and talk to them like a normal, like casual human being, as opposed to somebody who's like really nervous. As far as actual practice questions go, I'll include a whole bunch in the video description, so please feel free to check those out, like make a copy of them and do whatever you want. But just in this video, I'm going to talk about 5 questions that have come up in a lot of my interviews, and you should definitely be able to answer these questions well, because if you don't answer them well, there's a pretty good chance that your like score, I guess, is going to be lowered quite a bit and you might not get hired. So just make sure you understand these 5 questions really well. So the very first question is, what are the 3 pillars of information security? And if you've studied CompTIA, Security Plus, or anything really, you should probably know these as confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And I actually had, it's really insane, and I'm so sorry, I don't like talking crap, but I actually, I was on a panel interviewing an individual for like a security engineer job, and this person we're interviewing had a PhD level degree, and they were working as a consultant in security, and we asked them this question, and they said like confidentiality, integrity, and access control, and I was like, what? But anyway, I'm probably the most forgiving person I know, but I had to downvote them. I had to say no to hiring them because I don't know if they're nervous or what. But if somebody has like that level of education and experience, you cannot say like access control for A. It doesn't make sense. So CIA triad, just make sure you know that really well, and in your interview give examples of each one. So you can say like confidentiality means like preventing the disclosure of data, blah, 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 to people who are not supposed to see it. Integrity, give an example of what integrity is, like ensuring that the file hasn't been changed when it wasn't supposed to be, and that type of thing. And availability, you can say something, look up something to say, but it's just like ensuring the data is available to those who need it, something like this. Give examples for each one and know the triad really well, because everything is based off of it. The second question I see a lot is, what are vulnerabilities and threats, and what's the difference between them? So vulnerability is just a weakness in any system. It doesn't have to be a computer system. It can be literally anything. Like your data center can be vulnerable because you put it in a floodplain for some reason, or your system is vulnerable because it's exposed to the internet and it's running Windows XP or something like this. It's just any weakness in any system is a vulnerability. And threats, I've heard threat defined as kind of two separate ways. Like one definition is something that can exploit the vulnerability. So for example, like a hacker, it's a threat, or a flood is a threat. I've heard it defined as that. And then another way that I've heard threat is defined is basically like what will happen if the vulnerability is exploited, like an outage, like an outage is a threat, or a data breach is a threat. It's kind of more abstracted from just like the hacker being a threat, but the actual data breach that results of the hack being a threat. So just know the difference between threats and vulnerabilities, and you might want to throw an exploit there too. Know what an exploit is, like the verb and the noun of exploit. So yeah, that's number 2. The third one I hear a lot, probably almost every security interview I've had, is they say like, describe your home network to me. And they're just looking for a level of detail of understanding of like what's in your network. So if you say something like, oh, like I have a Comcast router and like my PC or something like this, while that may be true, it's kind of like I don't know how to say, like a normie level description. Like you want to be cognizant of all the IoT devices on your network, be cognizant of like your TV, like your cable box if you have one, your phones, if you have like an Alexa or something like this, if you're running virtual machines, because those are technically part of your home network. Just be cognizant of your whole network, and then the authentication system you have in place. Like I'm using like WPA2 personal with like a strong password that's like has a character depth of like whatever. Be as concise as you can, and make sure you expand it beyond like the generic normie response of like I have a Comcast router and a laptop or something like that. So just think about it, and you should be able to answer this question pretty well. The fourth question I hear every single time is, how do you stay up to date with cybersecurity in the world? And of course, step number 1 of this video covers that pretty well. Like podcasts, the Cyberwire especially is good at that. Another thing people tend to talk about is Twitter. Twitter's like really good for cybersecurity in general. Like you can follow certain people who tweet about stuff all the time, like CISA or like Hacker News or anything like this. Just look up, I'm sure there's like a thread on Reddit that has like all the best Twitter accounts to follow for cyber. So this one's pretty easy, you know, just be listening to podcasts, like start listening today and then look up some Twitter accounts and you should be good. And the last question I've seen all the time is, how do you measure risk? And the formal answer of this is basically, if you Google like risk matrix, you'll see what it is. But basically, you just look at a risk. You look at like how likely the thing is to happen and how much impact is going to happen. So for example, if something is really likely to happen, but the impact is like infinitesimally small, then the risk, you can say the risk is low. But if something is really likely to happen and the impact is really large, then of course the risk is large. So that's kind of the formal answer. Any variant of that will probably be good, but just look up a risk matrix and then kind of practice articulating your answer to that. The last thing I want to touch on this section is how to answer questions that you don't really know the answer to. Always, if somebody asks you something that you don't know, you should say like immediately that you don't know. Don't try to make up something weird, because they're just going to know right away. It's like so obvious based on your body language and a whole bunch of other factors that you can't even do anything about. So just admit that you don't know, but try to answer it anyway in the best way that you can. So for example, if somebody asks you like, they say like, tell me about your experience in incident response, like, you know, what have you done in the past or something like this. And if you've never worked in incident response before, you can say something like, well, I haven't officially worked in IR, but I know about like, you know, NIST 861, and I'm aware of like the incident response process, and I'd like to, you know, put it into use someday. And if you don't even know about, you know, NIST specifically, you can say something like, I haven't worked in incident response yet, but I'm aware that there's a lot of frameworks out there and it would be exciting to try it out in my career in someday. Like saying that, it's not really ideal, but it's way better than just it's better than lying, first of all. And it's also better than just saying like, oh, I don't know, and just leaving it at that. Showing that you have some knowledge that a framework at least exists and that you're willing to like check it out and try it is better than just being like, I don't know. So yeah, just think about how you would answer questions that you don't know the answer to. And you can get practice to this by going through that big list of interview questions I'm putting in the description. And for the ones that you don't initially know the answer to, just kind of think about how you would answer those in a way that's better than saying like, I don't know. So yeah, that's the last part. Communication and practice questions. And the last step in our process is all the easy stuff. It's just basic low effort things that you can do in order to come across as more professional. This step includes things like being on time. Just leave as early as makes sense and sit in the parking lot for 30 minutes if you have to. It's not worth being late or even close to being late, because you're going to be like not in the right headspace. Like even if you make it there like 1 minute before the interview, you're going to be like kind of messed up in your head. So just get there early, sit in the parking lot for 30 minutes if you have to, and you should be good. Another really easy thing you can do is just try to look as polished as possible. Just, you know, if you have hair, like wash your hair and like groom your facial hair, you know, trim your nails, just that basic stuff. And for your clothes, this is up for interpretation, but just try to dress as plainly and conservatively as possible. Like you don't really want to do anything that stands out too much, because you want the interviewers to focus on like, you know, what's in here versus be distracted by like anything out here. You want them to judge you based on the content of your character, not necessarily like the color of your Louis Vuitton belt or something like this. Like don't give the interviewers like anything to like really comment on like after you leave. Like, did you see that guy's shoes? Like, did you see their like Louis Vuitton belt? What are they trying to do with that? Like you want to like downplay all that stuff, like be as clean and polished as possible and downplay like kind of the physical aspect, and just like come with like A game like in your brain. You want to leave like that kind of impression. Like you don't want to distract the interview with like poor hygiene or like, you know, weird hair or like strange like clothes. I mean, it depends on the job, you know. Of course it depends on like your audience, but just try to like, as a general rule of thumb, just be like really polished, like as polished as you can. Another thing that people seem to have trouble with is speaking clearly and concisely. You just want to speak clear and be succinct, and don't drag on your answers for a long time. This is where step 3 of the practice interview questions and communication comes into play, because even if you don't really try, as long as you practice articulating the questions well, you'll be able to speak really clearly when it comes to the interview, because you've already practiced it and it's going to be second nature and you don't have to think about it, and it's just going to go really well for you. So just speak clear and concise. And lastly, you can think of some good, thoughtful questions you can ask to your interviewers after they're done asking you questions. Like you can ask them things like, are there any big initiatives going on in the department right now? Like, what do you personally like about working here? Or what was the main driver for this position that I'm applying for? And how can I best fulfill those requirements? And yeah, those are the 4 main steps that you can kind of do to get much better interviewing in security. And there's kind of one last thing that I want to talk about here. This is kind of something that I came up with by myself, so please take it with a grain of salt. But basically the thing is, even if you're the most perfect candidate in the world, like you have perfect education, you have all the certs, such good experience, like you look great, you articulate yourself well, perfect resume, everything is absolutely perfect. At most, you only have 50% chance of getting any given job. The other 50% of stuff that's kind of preventing you from getting the job is stuff that you have no control over. For example, like maybe the applicant pool is just too big. Maybe there was like 10,000 applicants and you just got filtered out for whatever reason. And unfortunately, there's like all those isms that exist too, like, you know, nepotism, racism, ageism, sexism, those kind of things. Those are all real things and you can't do anything about it. Maybe the interviewer was just having a bad day. Maybe they didn't like your shirt color. Maybe they didn't like your name. You just can't do anything about this 50%. It's your job, the 50% that you can't control, it's your job to max that thing out. And I'm kind of making these videos to kind of help you max out that section. Like, for example, like the, you know, how to get a job in IT, kind of at a high level outlines how to maximize out that 50% that you can control. This particular video kind of helps you how to max out like the interview section, like how to interview really well. So your job is to max out the section and do what you can do to get your job, because the other 50%, like you can't do anything about it. So just do your best to max out this section. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That is how to interview really well for cybersecurity jobs. And I hope you liked this video. If you did, please feel free to like and subscribe. If you know anyone else who wants to work in security, go ahead and share this with them. It would definitely help me out a lot. And I really appreciate you. I really appreciate you watching this far. But yeah, we will see you next time.
面接で差別経験あるの？私もあるかもしれないな。でも、よくわかんないし。